Welcome back for episode 25 of the Astronomical Apocrypha, the Seleukid Empire narrative let's play for Rome 2 with Divide et Impera. Last time, a ruse by Spurius Titinius lured the Roman city garrison and the compact Legio IV out in pursuit of Antiochus Hierax, who led the Hawk's Talons to victory in a rain-soaked field battle. The Seleukid prince and self-proclaimed viceroy of the West then set about the capture of Rome itself, smashing the gates and murdering the few remaining defenders amid flashes of lightning and thunderclaps, before setting about the occupation and instituting martial law. The heart cut out of the Roman state, the Seleukid front pushed even further into Italy with Hierax capturing Neapolis and Dymas completing the conquest of Latium with the acquisition of Ariminum. Seleukos II bargained for peace with the terrified Scythians as he desperately tried to manage an empire-wide food shortage from the far-flung reaches of his kingdom. And although Antigonos and Euclid suffered a brief setback as Amal came under assault by the Daha, the successful negotiation of the Elephant Trading Pact with India by Euclid enabled the capture of one of the last Parthian strongholds at Mariconda. The other last remaining general of the Old Guard, Diogenes, now seeks to cement his legacy and claim everlasting glory with the task of claiming the great city of Carthage from the Romans looming before him.
Bryson, what is this one called?
Thapsos, sir.
Another place to resupply, but we press on for Carthage. Pass through these gates victorious, and then into immortality.
We need to find another source of water. The nearby lake has more brine than the sea, and we had to guide the pack animals away from it.
The flesh is tested to determine if it's worthy of the divine. I would certainly be a figure in the royal cult if I were the king of Arabia and the satrap of Africa. And if Hierax can be the viceroy of the West, who is to say there can be no viceroy of the South?
Technically, Seleukos would say,
Yes, I know. Forget I mentioned it. When we get to Carthage, we'll pulverize their defenses until they're begging us to take the city. Never forget that. Always keep your foe at a distance. Have I told you about Agarios?
Of course you have, many times.
Yes, that's right. Sometimes I remember the court of Seleukos Nicator as if it were yesterday, when I cannot remember why I left my shield this morning. I've no children of my own, and that's why I need you, Bryson. But never mind what the men say about the sheep. It isn't true.
Of course not, sir. As you can see, Antiochus Hierax has not been idle in his Hellenization of Italia, the name of the once great eternal city of the Romans scoured from history and replaced as the eponymous Antioch on the Tiber in honor of its conqueror, while Hierax has made a gift of the nearby port city to his mother, now Laodicea by the sea. The western viceroy now stalks the Romans at Magna Graecia, beginning with their naval launching point and formerly Greek colony of Brundisium. However, with the Hawk's Talons still in transit, we'll be waiting at least another turn before committing to the siege. In the meantime, we have a bit of unfinished business with the city-state of Knossos, on the island of Crete, where Sosicles, to the surprise of no one, launches his attack from the northern beach. We waited long enough that this attack does not come with any substantial diplomatic repercussion. Sosicles and the Medusa head wielders are able to move on the city ahead of the nearby Knossos army, but still face significant resistance in the form of a small defending army, Ares Terror, a large garrison force and a small garrison navy coupled with an independent admiral and his flagship. We'll make our attack in the usual manner with this army that's reminiscent of the Hawk's Talons, presenting the defenders with a row of razor-sharp pikes flanked by shield-bearers, and with silver shields and royal peltasts on the wings. One difference with the Medusa head wielders is the overwhelming amount of ranged firepower at our disposal, with 2 regiments of armored Syrian archers accompanied by a huge battalion of Rhodian slingers. The garrison navy is heading straight for the shore, well ahead of their admiral, who's just now coming within sight of land, and I've dispatched a couple of slinger units and the royal peltasts to intercept the Marines. The main enemy garrison, along with the Spear of Ares, begin moving out of the town exit, spreading out slightly as they emerge, but still forming a dense, inviting cluster to our missile barrage. The Cretan Marines, disembarking on the shore, fall back hastily toward the greater body of the garrison, away from the threat of our peltasts, while a single unit of Thuriaphoroi cavalry skirmish briefly with our own citizen cavalry, before retreating to the safety of their infantry support. As the Gnossian infantry close on our main line, they suffer a tremendous amount of damage from Syrian arrows and Rhodian slingstones, many of their men wavering before they've even joined the hand-to-hand fighting that erupts as the front line of our silver shield pikes face off against some heavy thorax spearmen and the garrison commander Aristonomos and his thorax pikemen. The enemy cavalry have finally been dispatched by our own citizen cavalry, the way open for our Indian war elephants to make their devastating charge into the left-hand flank of the Cretan column. With flaming projectiles arcing in overhead, a barrage of slingstones from the right, and a mauling charge by the elephants tearing into the left, pandemonium erupts among the Gnossian infantry. As the elephants gore the infantry flank and rear more deeply, the silver shields move in cautiously behind them, also on the left flank, but there's such disarray among the enemy army that units are breaking almost as fast as they can be engaged. After just a few more moments of dedicated destruction, the entire garrison force is in full retreat, save for a few units surrounded by our own infantry and the enemy admiral who's just now making its way toward the shore. He's met by a hail of Rhodian slingstones as he pursues the unit of royal peltasts who've been deployed to intercept his retinue. He puts up a good fight, but is unable to cope with the royal peltasts while under constant bombardment by the slingers, and although just rallied inside the town, Aristonomos can only watch with despair as the rest of his defenders are either broken or annihilated. On the one hand, this was a typically weak and relatively low-tier force, and success was virtually guaranteed. Nevertheless, Sophocles managed to come through this battle with only minimal casualties, the loss of an elephant or infantryman here and there, while the Rhodian slingers scored a phenomenal number of kills, totaling over 1,100 combined, while the elephants, not far behind, scored over 700 for their single regiment. This leaves Knossos in a very unenviable position, their admiral driven far out to sea and their remaining sizable army now orphaned and stuck outside their former city, and both suffering attrition. The Romans intelligently moved their small but still potent legion in Magna Graecia inside the walls of Brundisium ahead of Antiochus' siege. Kyrenica asked to join their fight against the Garamantians, a proposition in which I have no interest at the moment, but our refusal to come to the aid of our friends doesn't stop them from helping to put down a small force of Phoenician rebels in Africa, while Parsa also does us a tremendous favor in assisting with the destruction of a now more substantial rebel force at Nisa. There's been another of the hostile political intrigues which plagued part of the early campaign, but which have thankfully become much less frequent of late, as Antiochus Hierax or Antigonos Doson have conspired to get Dymas killed. Although he escapes his death, his injuries require someone else to take command of the Slayers of Goliath, and from among the ranks of the rising officers, Plutarchos is chosen to lead, although not for any particular virtue other than the fact that his portrait is the only one that does not resemble another major character currently, although he's a dead ringer for the now long-deceased Cordelian. The native Cretans have had to content themselves with raiding the eastern half of the island, not being strong enough to challenge Sophocles at the city of Hierax. However, with the entirety of the island in range of the city, the Medusa head wielders are able to quickly strike at the Cretan army, who are just no match for us in troop quality in their weakened state. We could probably save a few soldiers by fighting this one manually, but the casualties are not too prohibitively high, so I take the auto-resolve destroying what little fight is left from the natives on Crete before Sophocles sets up his patrol on the island. A bit to the east of here, beyond Kypros and the Phoenician Sea, our military wharf is finally complete at Antioch, granting access to another echelon of power for our navies, particularly the availability of siege ships, and I'm using a significant part of my wealth for this turn to make sure I get a complement of 4 of these for the Heralds of Triton before they head back west to test out our new technology on our enemies in the Mediterranean. Those enemies, a faction that remains Rome in name only, are now firmly ensconced behind the walls of Brundisium, the next hurdle for Hierax to clear if he's to claim the entirety of the Italian Peninsula. Though his force has little hope of taking the city in an outright assault, Hierax sets up his siege with impunity, feeling invincible in a field battle ever since taking on the Romans outside Apollonia. Plutarchus then moves his men west through the Apennine mountain pass en route to garrison the new western Seleukid capital of Antioch on the Tiber. While in the wake of his departure, the civilians of Ariminum busy themselves with the construction in the city. Diogenes continues his dogged advance toward Carthage, encountering the defense of Thapsos first as the final stepping stone on the way to his ultimate conquest. As I've shown several times before, the battle against this garrison can be quickly won through a manual assault, and saving on the order of 1,000 casualties. And as before, I'll very quickly summarize the fight, without going into any unnecessary detail. One interesting note here is the heavy layer of fog rolling in from the sea to blanket the coastal city and the surrounding landscape. Nevertheless, I'm quite certain that the enemy soldiers will be drawn to our incendiary ballista like moths to a flame. They do make their advance, but begin from the far end of town, necessitating a shift of our force around the city edge. Our men rush to get into place, and the maneuver is much more chaotic than Diogenes would have liked, but it does happen to isolate the enemy general, who loses a number of his bodyguard in a charge by the Egyptian light cavalry, but manages to survive. Diogenes is forced to intervene to shore up the right flank, but after taking care of the reinforcing naval units, the battle line settles down a bit, and the superiority of our troops carries the day as our line begins folding in toward the enemy general. Several enemy regiments are broken in the shock of the initial push, although the remainder of the melee combat is a bit of a slog, slowly breaking one enemy unit after another, a combined effort between the cavalry and the Ethiopian archers clearing out the left flank, and the Seleukid infantry taking down the enemy general and his remaining units in the center. Because things didn't unfold exactly as I'd envisioned, we suffered 100 to 200 losses more than I would have hoped, but it's still much better to have fought the battle than to have left the lives of our men up to the auto-resolve. Another Roman settlement taken, and now just Carthage remains to unify the province of Africa under Seleukid control. Daha tries to poison the wells to soften up the Roman garrison, but is unsuccessful. I'm bringing Adelphius back from Laodicea by the sea, eventually to rendezvous with the heralds of Triton, as Scylla's terror passed through the Strait of Messina. Euclid destroys the Bactrian rebels near Bukhara before setting up a patrol stance, while Antilochus takes up a position near the border of Transoxania. After spending the last of our surplus on farming upgrades in Asia, we're ready to end the turn and welcome the year 228 BC. The Roman fleet chases Adelphius off, but fortunately he's nimble enough to move beyond the strait and well into the eastern Mediterranean ahead of their assault. The Garamantians have broken their alliance with the Romans, who have become increasingly isolated in their war with us. We finished the second tier naval maneuvers technology from the management branch, finishing the tier 2 management bonus and moving into the final technology of that branch of the military tree, fore and aft rigging. Although I knew it couldn't be far off, it's a shame to see Diogenes has died this turn, just short of his goal at Carthage. The old Stoic lived as long as any of my generals, and he's replaced with the eerily similar-looking Bryson. I have the money and influence this turn, and I pay a small amount to move both Bryson and Plutarchus over to the ruling political party. Africa is a mess right now, with frequent rebellions and atrocious public order, so I've dedicated much of my wealth for the turn to continuing the reconstruction of the province. Carthage, the jewel of northern Africa, looks imposing, but in reality is not that well defended, having only a small garrison for such a large city and a small accompanying army. Bryson, it turns out, is very well equipped for the siege assault with the veteran force at his disposal. We could take this city in the auto-resolve, but again I know the gods are on our side, so it isn't worth risking the losses. Carthage is a walled port city that is approachable from either side, but with its inland facing blocked by steep hills. I eventually choose to set up on the far side, north on this map, a pair of Royal Peltas units taking charge of the only 2 ladders available, and a Lithobolus trained on the wall. I decided to adopt a patient, persistent approach to this battle with such a relatively small force defending the city, and the greatest obstacle posed by the walls themselves, commanding the Lithobolus to hit the wall adjacent to the east side of the northern gate. It does take a while, but the ballista actually works much better against the wall than against the gate. This makes no sense to me, but after hammering the wall incessantly for a solid 5 minutes, I'm able to whittle down not 1 but 2 sections of the wall sufficiently that they crumble to dust. I'm only briefly interrupted by the Roman archer marines who have snuck up on our left flank and demand my attention, although they're obviously easy prey for my cavalry. The second wall section now destroyed, I start moving up my infantry, including the pike line and the peltas pushing the siege ladders, although unbelievably I still have enough ammunition to topple a third adjacent section of wall. Bryson leads the legionary infantry through the enormous breach to command the interfacing of the wall, as the ladders continue their slow advance toward the gatehouse. The light Egyptian cavalry slip in behind Bryson and his soldiers and begin maneuvering toward one of the nearby capture points. Bryson splits the legionaries to engage the Roman garrison beneath the wall and beneath the gatehouse as the pikes and hoplites move inside and the ladders finally make contact with the shoulders of the gatehouse. The defenders are low-quality troops, and most of them are weak missile infantry, so none pose a particular threat to our assault, as I concentrate on slowly and methodically capturing the gatehouse, adjacent towers, and nearby capture points. The main task remaining at this point is to finish off the defenders guarding the victory objective, which should either enable us to begin the countdown to victory if not seizing victory outright. I light up my pikes in the narrow streets leading up to the victory objective, although it's difficult to position them for a flanking attack due to a very limited approach for the attack. As the royal peltas mount the wall and battle against the last garrison swordsman regiment, Bryson leads his men around the western side of the city in pursuit of a group of citizen slinger levies, while the Egyptian horsemen work on taking control of another capture point. But the two groups swap places to enable the swift horsemen to run down the slingers, and Bryson and his men quickly gain control of the capture point. The Roman garrison commander refuses to budge from the victory objective, and with the rest of the city essentially undefended, I take my time in slowly working my infantry around the garrison captain's position, trapping a couple of levy units between a pair of pike walls, capturing the gatehouse and adjacent towers as well as the towers and capture points at the docks. With a large swath of the city perimeter under Seleukid control, Bryson, along with his retinue and one accompanying unit of Greek legionaries, confronts the defenders at the western flanking entrance to the victory objective. The garrison captain dispatching a unit of Italian swordsmen to meet the assault, while he and his retinue withdraw to defend the victory objective itself. The inevitability of the Seleukid assault eventually causes the units at either choke point to disintegrate and become more porous, and the Egyptian horsemen stream through the gaps to assault the garrison captain's retinue. As he becomes more overwhelmed by multiple Seleukid units, the Roman commander is caught and killed, the objective rapidly transferred to Seleukid control. The morale shock is sufficient to break the last few defenders at the northern wall. The lone unit of levy spearmen at the southern wall waver but refuse to break. The victory countdown, however, having begun, draws them out toward our position at the objective, but the total runs out completely before they ever arrive. Diogenes' protege, Bryson, manages to claim the victory that was snatched from the elder general and opposition party leader, as he lost his race with senescence. Carthage is now ours, and the Roman territories in Africa limited to a section of Mauritania and a small patch at the perimeter of the Great Desert to the south. Legio III is barely visible at the border to the west of Carthage, but I doubt they can contend with the Golden Fleece, and it seems they may have other more pressing problems, as a large Carthaginian fleet seems poised to strike at their port city to the west. Antiochus Hierax, now more isolated in his political position with the death of his biggest supporter Diogenes, summons his last remaining political ally, Antigonos Doson, to assist him in his siege of Brundisium, the Macedonian puppet king setting sail from Apollonia to arrive at the Roman port, while Antiochus continues building siege equipment at the walls. The presence of Antigonos Doson's small force does rouse the Roman defenders to action, although it seems that the Macedonians' transport ships are too far out to assist Antiochus Hierax in the sally by Legio IV and the garrison. Nevertheless, Hierax won't be backing down from this defense since we've proven his ability to win an almost identical battle outside the former city of Rome. This is another fairly similar fight, taking place miles from the city adjacent to the coast while not actually incorporating any naval or marine elements. There's a patch of forest to our right, to the south, and I set up my skirmish cavalry and elephants on the small grassy elevation overlooking the forest from the west, while the rest of the army lines up in the more open sandy scrubland near the beach. The Roman garrison is approaching, and nearly within range of our missile weapons, while Legio I is now just emerging in the distance. The citizen cavalry are sent out wide to the north in a flanking maneuver while the Hippocontisti move through the trees to the south, bypassing the garrison entirely, on an interception course with Legio I to the east. As the light horsemen arrive, they skirmish with the professional soldiers, drawing off about half of the advancing army, while 3 legionary cohorts continue unmolested. The garrison infantry are preceded by a brief altercation between their horsemen and our shield bearers on the right flank, and simultaneously the Syrian elephants are sent into the swordsmen holding the adjacent Roman flank. The hand-to-hand fighting between the Italian garrison militia and our own more elite troops proceeds in general like you might expect, with the outclassed citizen soldiers being badly beaten by the Greek professionals in most cases. Although Antiochus Hierax finds himself fighting a little too far out in front, losing a few of his royal bodyguard in his zeal to attack the garrison captain. The garrison captain holds out a while longer, as his army disintegrates before his eyes, and Hierax is joined in the melee by his silver-shield swordsmen, as the citizen cavalry and elephants mop up the enemies on the periphery. Our Hippocontisti have taken significant casualties running interference with Legio I, suffering the thrown Roman Pila, and in one case ignoring the skirmish orders and getting entangled briefly in a very bad melee engagement with the legionaries. Legio I arrives as the garrison captain is shattered, and now the Roman legionaries, while still extremely dangerous, no longer have the raw numbers of the garrison on their side. I didn't have the opportunity to properly reform my line before they make contact, but I'm nevertheless able to begin surrounding the legionaries, legionary veterans, and hastati as they engage our infantry. Hierax and his retinue moving clear around to the rear of their attack. It's just a grind of fierce hand-to-hand fighting now, swords clanging on shields and the Seleukid infantry pressing in from all sides. The Romans hold out a bit longer but really have no chance in this engagement, and eventually are routed, and we're free to let our cavalry run them down at our leisure. The Carthaginian fleet off the northern coast of Africa surprisingly chooses not to attack the Roman settlement, but rather sails between Corallus and Sicily to strike up a naval engagement with the small Roman fleet there. The once legendary Phoenician sailors have now been upstaged by the new Roman technology, as the apparently larger Carthaginian fleet is completely wiped out by the smaller Roman classis. Hierax, now with the garrison and Legio I all but destroyed, plenty of siege equipment at his disposal, and the assistance of Antigonos Doson, is free to capture Brundisium with impunity, taking the city in a lopsided auto-resolve. The capture of the adjacent road system has also enabled Antigonos Doson to disembark and move directly on Cosentia. Although he's badly outnumbered by the garrison, the sons of Cyclops will attempt to keep the city surrounded until Antiochus Hierax arrives. Our common aim is clearer than ever against the Romans. I'm able to upgrade our treaties with the Carthaginians, although they're unwilling to agree to a military alliance, perhaps the foreign occupation of Carthage, even by an ally, too much to stomach. If we're to maintain hegemony in Africa, we need to rebuild the infrastructure as quickly as possible, and most of my money this turn is devoted to the conversions at Carthage and the surrounding regions. At Carthage itself, I spent a while trying to decide what to convert the Tier 3 cultural building to, eventually setting on a satrap's palace, figuring that the Persian influence is of little concern so far west, and the building has a +4 experience bonus for new dignitaries, which may be handy if I have to replace any of my aging governors or noblewomen. Lastly, there's an empty construction slot now at Rhodes, which is nothing exciting, but we don't want any slums to deal with in the near future. The typically pugnacious Romans are unwilling to let Antigonos Doson and his small army surround their city at Cosentia, and they sally forth and attack right away. I was tempted to try to fight this battle even with this small army, given my success against similarly large but low-tier garrisons in the past, but thought better of it, given Antigonos Doson's lack of sword and shield infantry. So much to the chagrin of Viceroy Hierax, he abandons his position at the city walls for now. Militarily, the Parthians are still quite strong despite their rapidly shrinking domain, and I had positioned Seleukos II at the border with Actau in the hopes of ambushing one of their armies, but they've evidently scouted his position and avoid being drawn into the trap. Conversely, it's Euclid who's caught off guard by the Daha as one of their rapid strike forces emerges from the north, and as the old general is in patrol stance, and Antilochus is just out of range on the far bank of the river, this amounts to an offensive ambush on our patrolling force.
Ah, what a magnificent bird. This is not the common goose of these lands. He must be far from home. Look at his wingspan and the grace of his flight, like an arrow sent high on the wind. I should like to watch him fly a bit longer before we spring our trap on the ignorant Greeks. How well a man rides a horse and with what skill he shoots a bow, that is the measure by which we are all judged in these lands. And the Greeks can do both of these things, but not at the same time. It does not matter. Come, let us move quietly among them and slit their throats while they sleep. Do not make a sound. What is that honking? The goose! It will wake them all! Shoot it down! Shoot it down!
We're caught awkwardly in a marching column with Euclid's heteroi at the front, followed by the spears and pikes, the swordsmen and the elephants, and then the archers lingering behind the baggage train and the artillery, with a small rearguard of Cilician haploi, and our enemies galloping out of the northern forest and arrayed along our right-hand flank. This army with its numerous horse archers will be difficult to fight, especially from our disadvantaged position. Euclid orders the pikemen to immediately turn about rightward to present the enemy with their pike phalanx, as he rides back to join it with the motley cavalry at our own disposal on the left wing. The shield bearers, hoplites, and swordsmen likewise attempt to form a line in the most expedient fashion, and the archers pull back toward the rear of the makeshift formation. The elephants begin moving straight in toward the numerous enemy, and while this drives them back, the elephants, in spite of being armored, sustain significant losses very quickly against the eastern horse archers. Euclid at least finds some success in battling the Daha heavy melee cavalry, and our infantry line stands fairly solid against the Partho-Hellenic infantry and the Parthian bodyguards of the enemy general, who has a fairly long and challenging name to pronounce. My elephants dropping like flies against the horse archers, and without any real strategy to combat them, I resort to a ranged duel with my Greek archers showering the enemy cavalry with their own arrows. This works to some extent, the relatively cheap and numerous Greek toxotai being arguably more effective with their bows than the Daha bow-equipped riders. At this point, with the furious melee underway and arrows flying in each direction overhead, the battle degenerates into a deadly bloodbath, both sides refusing to give ground or admit defeat, as the casualties continue to mount. One of the enemy heavy cavalry regiments pulls away from the fight with our pikemen, who are tempted to give chase. I realize that there are 4 horse archer regiments that will just whittle the men down as they skirmish away, so I decide to concentrate on the riders still in melee. But it's an unwinnable situation for the phalangitai, who are forced to turn their back to the attackers to perform a rear attack on the engaged heavy cavalry regiment. This breaks the Daha heavy cavalry battling our rightmost unit of citizen cavalry, but our phalangitai take horrendous casualties in the process and suffer another charge from the cavalry regiment that just pulled out, before they're able to completely reform their pike wall. And subsequently both they and my citizen cavalry regiment are wiped out. Meanwhile, the horse archers and Greek toxotai continue trading arrows, and the hand-to-hand fighting continues, although the Daha general has withdrawn to the safety behind his line. The bodies continue piling up, and Euclid continues his struggle against the Iranian noble cavalry on the left. The situation looks very bad for us as our numbers continue to decline, although just when the situation looks unsalvageable, 2 rallied units of toxotai along with the artillery crew managed to get a handle on the Daha horse archers on the right flank, reducing them to a single remaining unit, while at the same time our decimated legionaries and Cilician haploi fight off the Partho-Hellenic infantry on the right side. The Daha horse archers on the right have either exhausted their quivers, or they see an easy target in the Lithobolus crew as they charge straight into melee, no longer being bombarded by our toxotai who are in retreat. Shockingly, the stout artillery crew manhandle their attackers and completely drive off the last of the right-hand Daha riders, and similarly the infantry line has freed itself completely from the hand-to-hand fighting, leaving only Euclid struggling against the enemy general and the noble cavalry and the 3 remaining Daha horse archer regiments on the left. The fighting is now about even on the balance bar, and the battle does seem to be on a razor's edge, as the loss of any significant contributor on either side could swing the balance decisively. My infantry continues soaking up arrows, but the thick armor and large shields of my remaining troops are well suited to this job. As the shield bearers and hoplite hold their ground, the Daha eventually run out of arrows and commit themselves to melee one after another, and even in their exhausted, weakened state, the Greek spearmen prove themselves the superior combatants. Finally, with his army reduced to shreds, Euclid finishes off the Parthian noble cavalry and scoops up the feathered carcass of his old watch goose from among the innumerable bodies littering the battlefield. The ghastly results of this battle demonstrate a complete tactical failure by Euclid, and by myself for that matter. Aside from the elephants, however, we only lost our baggage train and a single unit of phalangitai, meaning that we should be able to replenish our losses with time in our own territory. Another bizarre report of garrison attrition to mark the start of our next turn, one of DEI's many features I fear I'll never fully appreciate. With a growing rebellion near Leptis Magna, along with a supposedly friendly Cairene force raiding the region, Rhizon departs from Carthage, moving swiftly through Thapsos to bring his army nearer to the afflicted region. Antigonos Doson returns to Cosentia, but this time supported by Antiochus Hierax, he's able to get a little glory for himself by overwhelming the garrison and occupying the city, finally getting some revenge on the Romans for their attacks at Apollonia and Epidamnos. Our wealth this turn is on the upswing, and I'm able to get many conversions started at Magna Graecia, which now lacks only the Sicilian regions to unify the province. To the east, the Heralds of Triton have finally met up with Scylla's terror south of Sparta, and I move a few ships to Adelphius' command before splitting the two fleets and adding still more ships to the Heralds. Not only would the naval supremacy be helpful at this stage, but we'll need a total of 60 ships or 3 full-stack fleets to achieve the military victory. Antilochus moves in toward Cath, which is now undefended except for its substantial garrison, although he isn't in range for an attack or siege yet. Euclid also isn't ready to assist, although, as noted, his force has already replenished substantially from the dreadful ambush last turn. While he waits, I hire a couple more heavily armored hoplite units to fill out the ranks. The Parthians begin their turn by bringing an army to attack the oft-besieged city of Nisa. This is one of those circumstances where I felt like a manual defense attempt was warranted, the balance bar notwithstanding, since we have some heavily armored hoplite at our disposal. But as we'll see again, the Eastern Horse Archers are a potent enemy and difficult to defend against. We've seen this style of defense before, as the enemy approached the southern town entrance, and I've split my defenders to defend each side of the fork. The Parthians commit their attackers to both approaches, and while our hoplite hold up well initially, rapidly breaking the weakened Parthian spear infantry, one of their heavy horse units slips past, darting into the center of town and threatening the rear of the eastern defense. I detach a unit of hoplite from the western fork to oppose them, and although it looks like they intend to double back, they resume their rear charge on my defenders at the eastern fork, who are looking increasingly beleaguered. Meanwhile, the horse archers add to this mayhem with their arrows pouring into our defenders. My Toxotoid levies return fire and actually do well against the lighter Parthian horsemen, but the problem here are the 4 regiments hanging around the edge of town, including 3 complements of Scythian armored horse archer irregulars, accompanied by their general and his retinue of noble Parthian horse archers. The Parthian nobles are well armored with an armor rating of 42, but the Scythian horse archers have an insane armor rating of 61, making them almost invincible against this garrison. So as it is, even though our men appear to be slowly gaining ground as they whittle down the Parthian infantry on the front lines, we're still badly disadvantaged, and I realize with little hope of winning. We manage to drive off all but one of the attackers inside the town, but stand little chance against the Scythian mercenaries, who mercilessly shoot down our defenders from horseback at a safe distance. Although we killed a substantial number of enemies, only a few units were fully eliminated, and the defense ultimately proved futile. Worse still, the Parthians, evidently not falling for Seleukos' trap, bring in both of their armies to attack his position directly, and now the young emperor, like his chief advisor Euclid, is in a fight for his life against the Eastern Horsemen. The main thing Seleukos has going for himself in this fight is a wall of heavily armored pikemen and hoplite protecting a huge number of infantry archers. I'm hopeful that the archers and ballista will give us a missile advantage, and the infantry can hold out against the Parthian arrows. The Parthians send in their horse archers first, which is preferable, letting our men engage in the shootout without the pressure of an infantry engagement. Unfortunately, however, one of the units of Parthian melee cavalry slips around the right flank and runs amok among the Greek Toxotoi as I try to desperately counter them with the rightmost hoplite regiment. The Parthian frontline infantry, as before, proved to be no match for our own soldiers, including the White Shield Pikes, Thorax Machaerophori, or Seleukos' own elite retinue. I'm also able to maneuver my citizen cavalry around the flank to inflict a decisive rear attack on the Parthian heavy infantry. Likewise, one of the Thorax sword regiments inflicts a devastating blow by killing the Parthian general relatively early on in the battle. The reinforcing Parthian army has by this point emerged from the fog and are adding their own horse archers to the huge number opposite our front line, although the melee infantry are just visible in the distance and we've nearly driven off the infantry of the First Army. I reform our battle line as Seleukos takes charge of eliminating the last Parthian infantry regiment at the right flank. My archers aren't free to fire at the horse archers yet, as they concentrate on the melee cavalry regiment behind our own line, fortunately destroying them before training their bows on the enemy mounted archers. Another melee engagement unfolds, not unlike the first, our infantry slightly weakened and tired but still superior, holding off the Parthian infantry as my heavy cavalry again circle around, this time in a very wide arc to encircle the enemy rear. The citizen cavalry charge annihilates the Parthian missile infantry and their remaining horse archer regiments behind their front line, while my own remaining foot archers destroy the Parthian mounted bowmen. The Parthians evidently know what's coming next, as their remaining melee infantry begin wavering in unison in anticipation of the deadly cavalry charge into their rear. And it turns out it only takes the imminent threat of destruction to completely shatter what remains of the Parthian army, sparing us further combat aside from the effort of running down their enemy survivors. Though the victory was not without its cost and classed as a close victory by the game, I consider this a great upset in Seleukos' favor and probably represents a turning of the tide in the long Parthian War, with nearly 4,000 Parthians dead or wounded and the strength of their military broken and unlikely to recover soon. Seleukos doesn't wait for the winter snows of Scythia to pass, but rather marches directly into Aktau with his replenished force and destroys what remains of the northern Parthian military presence, quickly finishing off his aggressors while Euclid and Antilochus begin their siege of Cath. The Romans, driven entirely from their homeland into the Mediterranean and humiliated by the loss of their eponymous Eternal City and their captured African jewel of Carthage, Hierax and Antigonos Doson prepare to return Syracuse to Greek control, and a tremendous Seleukid naval buildup has begun in anticipation of a war for control of the Mediterranean itself. Seleukos II has, after much patience and perseverance, all but vanquished his Parthian enemies, who hold on to a shred of their former kingdom with a ghost of their former military strength, and their Daha allies cower behind the walls of Cath as the virtuous Antilochus and a vengeful Euclid prepare their siege.